Hi, I'm Kevin, and today I want to address a serious issue. During my Tour 6 video, I made a really lame joke when after roughly 30 minutes I announced that everything up to this point was just the introduction. When I wrote this line during the scripting phase, I felt really smart and funny. But then I stopped and looked at it more critically. The sentence is on page 9 of the script. I made a quick check and found out that there were more than 5,000 words leading up to it. Then I opened my script for the Crypt of the Necrodancer video, which is about 7,500 words long. So I was already close to reaching that length and I didn't even start talking about Tour 6. This was concerning, and in hindsight it started a trend. The jump to the Valkyria Chronicles 4 video is not as extreme, but it still continued the streak of videos that keep getting longer. Which is not problematic by itself. In fact, I like these long labyrinthian essays, and I wouldn't want them to be even a minute shorter. When I tell you a story, I want to give you the full picture. So I will carry on creating these pieces that are way over an hour. But they have one disadvantage. They take so much time. Scripting, recording, editing, and especially correcting all the mistakes at the end and re-rendering the whole thing a couple of times. That's the reason for the huge pauses in between my videos, and that's not ideal. There are many stories I want to tell you, but not all of them need this whole setup with long-winded introductions, wandering off to related topics, and comparisons to similar games. Some can just be short stories. And that's why I want to test out a new format today. Short story time is my attempt to focus on stories that are brief by design. No side quests, no history bit at the beginning, just one topic. Something that I find noteworthy or funny, but that doesn't need to be elaborated from multiple perspectives. And to challenge myself, I will set a time limit of 15 minutes. I'm not sure how this will work, but if it's over 15 minutes, then I failed. But only after this introduction, of course. So stop checking the length of the video now, the timer starts after the title card. I've gone on record claiming that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles
Shredder's Revenge
was my game of the year in 2022. And I still think that's an excellent choice. Shredder's Revenge is a fantastic game. But that's a story for another day, because even more interesting than the game itself is its legacy. It is the successor of a long line of games that began in the year 1989 with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game. This one is remarkable for several reasons. For one, it is a really solid beat-em up that looked and sounded great for its time.
Tonight I dine on turtle.
But more importantly, it was and is Konami's highest grossing arcade cabinet. That, together with the 4 million sold copies of the Turtles game for the Nintendo Entertainment System, cemented the Turtles as one of Konami's most successful gaming franchises at the beginning of the 90s. Until 1994, they produced the 3 mainline titles for the NES, 3 for the Game Boy, Turtles in Time for arcade and Super Nintendo, Hyperstone Haste for the Sega Genesis, and many more obscure spin-offs. There were more Turtles games than for other popular Konami franchises in these years, which is astounding. And if you want to get a taste of that time, then I can recommend the Cowabunga collection that was released in 2022. It includes all the big titles of that era. But to be frank, Turtles in Time and Hyperstone Haste are all you need. Those games are amazing, even by today's standards, and they alone make buying the collection worth it. Actually, I bought it first and foremost to finally own Turtles in Time. I still have my Genesis cartridge of Hyperstone Haste, but I only played Turtles in Time at a friend's house before. And since I brought both of them up, I have to make a comment on the eternal debate which of those two is better. There's an easy answer. Just play both of them back to back. That's what I did when I got my hands on the collection, and it was a great time. Well, at least the gameplay part, because back then I was sick for a week and that was not so great. The first 2 days consisted of me lying in bed, feeling really down and lamenting my life. But after that I slowly recovered, and when I felt better I played Turtles games. And not only these two classics. I also tried the original arcade game for the first time, bashed my head against tournament fighters, and then I took a look at the Game Boy games. I was actually quite interested in those, because I remember owning 2 of them when I was a child. You probably guessed by now that I was a huge Turtles fan back then. And how could I have resisted a game with such a cover artwork? Look at that. Even if you hate the Turtles, you have to admit how radical that looks. The second one is a huge step down, but besides the cover art, I had fond memories of these games. I remember that as a kid, I claimed that they were among the best on the Game Boy. Which is quite a statement considering I also owned The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, but that's a story for another day. So now as an adult, still recovering from my illness, I had the opportunity to relive these memories and to check if I could still support the judgment of my child self. And let me tell you, back then I was a lousy game critic, because those games, well, they do look and sound well for Game Boy titles. Especially the second one features detailed sprites. Also they are very short, which is a positive, because completing them is not a great experience. They are both action platformers in which you control the 4 turtles and navigate through a couple of linear levels. However, calling them the 4 turtles is quite a stretch, because they all look and play the same. You can only distinguish them by their weapons, but not by their attack animations. However, I have to give them credit for their life system. When you die on a level, the turtle you're currently playing is captured and you can only continue with the remaining ones, unless you manage to free them again. That's the best feature these games have. The first one, Fall of the Foot Clan, offers some variety in the platforming. The highlight is level 2, in which you jump on these pillars while fighting enemies, which can get hectic. But fighting enemies is where the game feels repetitive. They spawn, move towards you, and you hit them. That's most of the game. There are a couple of enemy types with different patterns and 5 boss fights that can get tricky, but none of them could really convince me. And the second one, Back from the Sewers, is even worse. It uses bigger, more detailed sprites, which make the screen feel cramped. So when an enemy appears, you have to quickly react, and that seems to be the main gameplay loop. Especially in the later stages, enemies are constantly spawning on both sides of the screen and jumping at you, which leads to a lot of this. It gets old fast, which is a shame because the game has some cool ideas. But ultimately they are both not worth checking out today. And that was my expectation for the third Game Boy title, Radical Rescue 2. This one was new for me, I never played it as a child, and so I was surprised when the game started with a story cutscene. This was already a big change compared to the other games. However, at first it is nothing special, a typical turtle scenario. They are watching TV, April O'Neil gets kidnapped and they head out to rescue her. But there's a twist. Michelangelo was missing, he was getting some pizza. And when he returns, he gets a TV message from Shredder that all the other turtles have been captured. For some reason he tells Michelangelo where he can find his brothers, and so he heads out to rescue all of them. So when the game starts, you can only control Michelangelo. Apart from that, the game feels similar to the first 2, but I have to mention that the smaller sprites go a long way on allowing more maneuvers on the screen. Fighting enemies still doesn't feel great, but way better than before. Also for the first time on Game Boy you get a move that is specific to a single turtle, this helicopter hover. Don't get me started on the physics here, it doesn't make sense at all. But this really feels like something only Michelangelo and his nunchucks could do. And it is really handy, allowing for some tight air movement. While I was still exploring the possibilities of that move, I already entered the second location, these mines where the rest of the turtles were held. I was slightly impressed with the verticality of these screens and how they complemented the level design. All of this felt like a huge improvement. And then I entered this area where I had to move downwards and then... odd, multiple paths. They all seem to continue somewhere, one of them even into another area. It was at this point where it dawned on me what was going on here. I checked all of the buttons and when I pressed select, this happened. Yeah, this is the map of the game. Radical Rescue doesn't have multiple levels, the whole game takes place in one interconnected space. It immediately reminded me of Super Metroid. There were even these dots which Metroid uses to indicate that there's something you can pick up here. So I made my way to one of those, explored this facility, came by some new obstacles and weird looking blocks, and finally ended up in front of a Mega Man boss door. Yep, it led to a boss fight, and defeating it awarded me with a key. And when I continued exploring, I found a locked door, and behind it was Leonardo. So that's Radical Rescue's gameplay loop in a nutshell. Explore a location, find a boss, get the key, and rescue one of the turtles. Which you can control afterwards, and Leo didn't have the helicopter hub of Michelangelo. Instead he had this. I returned to these weird boxes and yes, this game, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Radical Rescue, is a Metroidvania. A huge interconnected map with multiple areas, certain obstacles you cannot overcome at first, and you gradually gain new abilities to deal with them. And there are also hearts you can find that permanently increase your maximum health, pizzas that function as healing items, and keycards to open closed doors. It is still a Game Boy game, which means it is pretty short, but it nevertheless is a full-fledged Metroidvania. And I like the idea that you gain new abilities by finding new team members. It feels way more organic than getting power-up items. Raphael is able to get in his shell and slide over the ground to get through narrow spaces. Why is he the only one who can do that? I don't know, but I already accepted the helicopter move, so I won't ask questions here. And finally, Donatello has a gadget to climb on walls, which is the most transformative ability. Leo and Raph are used for specific obstacles, but Don's ability recontextualizes most areas. And as soon as you have all 4 turtles, the game leaves the linear structure it was following until this point behind and asks you to use the turtles' abilities to find your own way. You have to develop a spatial awareness of the whole area and understand how the different areas connect. And there even are some cute moments where you have to combine the tools you have. It's a great time, and afterwards you enter the final stretch of the game, the spacious last area with a couple of intersections and multiple paths you can explore. Navigating this place is another treat, and the difficulty ramps up as well. Although for my taste they overdid it with the final boss, that one can become frustrating. But apart from that, for a Game Boy game it sure is impressive, a quick burst of Metroidvania goodness. Of course, in a comparison with the giants of that genre, Radical Rescue would not fare that well. Mainly because it is too short and doesn't offer that much depth. Nevertheless, it is a very interesting game, because it was released in 1993. That's 1 year before Super Metroid and 4 before Castlevania Symphony of the Night, the 2 games that defined the genre as we know it today. However, it's not like Metroidvanias didn't exist before them. There were already prototypes in both franchises with the original Metroid in 1986 and Castlevania II Simon's Quest in 1987. And there were other games even before Metroid that can be considered Metroidvanias. Still, Radical Rescue is an intriguing case because it released in this period between the Metroidvania prototypes and the refined genre classics. In 1993, the Metroid and Castlevania series were actually shying away from Metroidvanias, and both produced more linear titles. Especially Metroid 2 Return of Samus is worth mentioning here, because it is also a Game Boy game, but it has a much more linear structure. As a result, Radical Rescue feels closer to Super Metroid than Return of Samus. So is this little Turtles game the missing link of the genre? It was developed by Konami after all. There has to be a connection to the team that would go on developing Symphony of the Night, right? Unfortunately, I couldn't find any evidence for that. There's no overlap in the people listed in the credits, and to my knowledge, Radical Rescue was never mentioned in interviews about Symphony of the Night. That's a shame. Imagine how cool it would be if Koji Igarashi, the mastermind behind many Metroidvanias, would show up here. That would have been the perfect ending for this story. And it would force me to make a much longer video. But as it stands, this story ends with a mystery. Why was Radical Rescue so different to the other Game Boy titles? And to all the Turtles games? This ambitious little Metroidvania is definitely an outlier in the franchise. How did they come up with the idea? What were their inspirations? And did Koji Igarashi or anyone in the Symphony of the Night team ever play it? We can only speculate. Whatever the answers may be, Radical Rescue is a curious case, and that's why I wanted to tell my story about it. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for watching. When looking at the ranking, keep in mind that there are only great games on this list. Radical Rescue deserves to be here, but it simply has less to offer than the others. Ha, I stayed in my time limit.